So this afternoon, we are going to start diving more specifically into the topic, and we will do this in two parts. The first part is going to be this session right here, which is going to be, you're going to hear from me about the main ideas that are at play on each side of the topic we will be debating this fall. Then in session two, we'll talk about public forum research and public forum evidence, and we will start doing some of our own research on the topic that we can hopefully use in some of the debates that we will be doing tomorrow. So before I get into my presentation here, I want to make something super clear, which is I am not a social media expert. And as I'm giving this presentation, I am by no means suggesting that people should accept what I say about social media blindly or assume that I am right about what I'm saying. What I want you to do instead is to take what I say as kind of a broad outline for what kind of themes could be brought up on either side, or as points of departure or as places for you to start doing research. So this is not an end to your research or to your evidence gathering. It's a starting point or a place where you can get ideas for what kind of arguments you yourself will want to develop. So the resolution, for those of you who don't recall, this is the resolution. In Taiwan, social media is beneficial for democratic values. Now, we've obviously talked about this a little bit, but let's take a step back and pretend or imagine that you're seeing this resolution for the first time. If you were doing your own debate preparation or research, what would your first step be if you saw a resolution like this? What do you think? What would people do? Challenge it. Okay, what do you mean? Okay, I think what both of you are, okay, counter evidence, yeah. Okay, so I think what both of you are thinking about is good, but it's several steps ahead of what I'm trying to get at, right? So it's great to think about why the resolution could be true or why the resolution can be false. But Eric is exactly right that before we do anything at all about the research or coming up with reasons, we need to figure out what the terms in this resolution mean. So Emily thinks we should define social media. I agree. Social media is a really important word in this resolution that we need to figure out what the resolution is talking about. There's one other key word I would say in this resolution that we need to figure out, or phrase. What do we think that is? You got social media. What else? Democratic values. 3 people at once. Absolutely right. So those, I would say, are the two main concepts that we need to flesh out in more detail before we start researching it, right? Because if social media means something different than we think, that could change what arguments are available to us on both the pro side and the con side, right? If I ask you all what social media is, you might be thinking of Line or Twitter or Facebook, right? But other people might think of something else. So it's really important to get on the same page about what we are talking about. So let's start with social media. What do you all think of when I say social media? What is it? Okay, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, sure. What else? Newspaper, interesting. Okay. Emily says a platform where we can socialize with other people, a platform that can connect with people all over the world, platform to communicate. Okay, so interesting. Okay. Alexander, is a phone social media? No, but it's a platform to communicate. So what else does social media need that a phone does not have? It should be media. Okay, good idea. So what does the media part mean? A phone is line with social a phone with line is social media. Okay. So what does line have that a phone doesn't? Emily says it spreads information. Software. Okay, so maybe it needs to be a computer program. It can't just be a telephone, like a okay, so you think it's it's the program, it's not the physical object of the phone. You need apps. Okay. These are all good ideas. All right, so what about Zoom? We're all talking on Zoom. It's a platform, we're socializing. It's media. I've shown you some pictures and we're connecting all over the world. I'm in the US, you're in Taiwan, so we're connected, right? So is Zoom social media? We got could be, we got no, we got sort of. Ah, okay. So we got some edge cases here. Zoom is a communication tool. Okay, yeah. What about YouTube? It's got media, you've got comments, you can talk to each other. What do we think about YouTube? You think yes, okay. YouTube can be. It's about sharing pictures and videos, the objective to be connected. Williams says no, YouTube is not social media. Okay, so the very interesting. So the point of this exercise, and why I'm kind of asking you this, is to underscore this point that it's not obvious, right? There are these edge cases where we can be a little bit unsure, and what counts as social media is going to really depend on our definition. Ooh, interesting. People can create and post their own contents. I like that. So I like all of these ideas. I'm gonna throw some definitions up on the slideshow here. And before I do that, I just want to make clear all of your ideas are perfectly good. And when I'm putting definitions up here, I'm not saying they're the only correct ones. In fact, some of my definitions disagree with each other. I think someone asked this on day one, but this is part of something that the debaters or the teams need to figure out in the actual debate if it's something they disagree about. So if two teams don't agree whether YouTube is social media, that can be part of the debate. The two teams can present their definitions and argue which one is better. But so let's look at some. So when I Googled social media definition, here are two examples that came up. And we have a lot of these ideas that you have described. So we've got the idea that it's a website or an application. Yep. A lot of you mentioned the idea of creating or sharing content. Those people who talked about connecting with others or using it for communication, this definition calls that social networking. The Cambridge Dictionary says a lot of the same stuff, but it clarifies that in addition to all of that, it also has to be on the internet and it has to use a computer or cell phone. So these italics are what I added, by the way, to show what I think are the key or important parts. So that gives us some idea, I think, and that lines up pretty well with what we came up with. But interestingly, you know, we not only have some Google definitions or some dictionary definitions, there are also scholarly definitions. So let's look at some of those. This is one of the most popular ones I found. And By the way, we'll get into this more during the research section, but someone asked this morning whether there's a standard way to present public forum evidence. And this is an example of that. This is what we call a card, or an evidence card. Those of you who are coming from NTNU English debates, you are familiar with that term, evidence card. So this is what a public forum evidence card looks like. And sometimes you will see it with highlighting to show which part a debate team is quoting directly. I'll go into that in more detail. At this point, the key takeaway is this looks weird, I know, but don't be overwhelmed. I will unpack what this is in a second, and it will seem much less intimidating once we do go over how to create this. So this is what the scholarly definition says. It is, so this person or these two people who are experts in technology and media went through scholarly definitions in the literature, and they came up with 4 common themes. They are Web 2.0 internet-based applications, user-generated content. So that's something a few of you mentioned. Something you all didn't mention, I don't think, but something that the scholarly work considers to be important is the idea that people have to be able to create profiles on the website. And as you all mentioned, and as the other definitions mentioned, these services have to enable the creation of social networks. And people have cited this definition to claim that some weird stuff is included in the label social media. So here's a longer quote. I apologize, that's a little small. But the relevant quote is this part right here. So this person's a lawyer, and they're trying to figure out what social media means in a contract. And they're citing that scholarly definition, and they're saying social media includes many other internet-based applications, such as WordPress, which is a website used for blogs, Instagram, Second Life. Does anyone know what that is? Give me a thumbs up if you know what that is. I'm guessing 1 or 2 of you might know, but most people probably don't. No. Second Life is basically, it's a video game kind of, but there's no game. You just log in and you have a character and you can run around and you can talk to people. So it's like an MMO. It's kind of like World of Warcraft, but there's no game. You just talk to people. So it's kind of like a chat room, but yeah, you have an avatar that you can run around with, and you can like spend money to buy a house, or you can like build a mall, or you can shop, and there's all kinds of stuff, and the graphics are terrible, but according to this person, that's social media. Yeah, it's a little like VR chat, which this person doesn't mention, but I think they would probably say VR chat is social media too. But yeah, you got like, so Second Life, that's pretty weird. Then we got like Flickr. So that's for sharing pictures. We have Wikipedia, which you all know what that is. YouTube, which we disagreed about earlier. This person actually says World of Warcraft is even social media because people gather there and they can talk to each other and they can use chat and they can interact, and it's online and you run around. Then you got Yelp for reviews, and Amazon also, I assume, because it has reviews. So that's a pretty weird list. It's got some stuff on there that if you asked me, like, I would not say it's social media. Like, if you asked me if Amazon is social media, I would say no. Right? And I assume most of you would too. So like, who if I hadn't showed you this, if I asked you if Amazon is social media, how many people would say no? Give me a Zoom react if you would say no. Are you raising your hands to ask a question or to say you would say no? Okay, got a lot of no's. So again, it's pretty disputed. And even these people who are experts and who have done a lot of research to figure out what social media means have some pretty weird opinions about this. So, all right. So at the narrowest, we have a pretty good idea. So social media at least includes stuff like Facebook, like Instagram, like Twitter, like Line, and at most, it includes basically anything where we are communicating on the internet with a profile. So it's a pretty big spectrum. Okay. But what are the main social media apps? So this is a breakdown of the most popular social media apps in Taiwan. And it's ranked by the percentage of people who use the internet, who use these apps. And you can see that although we had some disagreement about if YouTube is a social media app at all, it's actually the most popular social media app in Taiwan, even though, you would never guess. And then we have some more, some less surprising names. We've got Facebook, we've got Line, Instagram, Facebook Messenger, WeChat, Twitter, pretty unpopular in Taiwan compared to other parts of the world. As is TikTok, I would say. I think TikTok is probably less popular in Taiwan than in other places, although don't quote me on that. I'm not sure. So yeah, so that gives us, I think, a pretty good idea of what social media. TikTok is popular. Yeah, I mean, 21% of people use it, according to this chart, which I believe is from 2018, if I remember correctly. But I'm not sure if TikTok is more popular than in other places or if it's as popular or less. I think it's more popular in the US than in Taiwan, but again, I could be wrong. So that hopefully gives us a general idea of what we're talking about. I want to mention Line especially because Line was something surprising to me. So when I got to Taiwan for the first time, I had to install Line because that was how I did my quarantine. And I thought Line was just a texting app. Like, I didn't realize there was more to Line than just texting. I didn't realize you had like a profile and you could subscribe to stuff. So I assume most of you probably know this, but I went and did some double checking. Like, wait, why do people think Line is social media? And actually, the US CEO of Line, as you can see in this quote, specifically says that although it's a different kind of social media, it still counts as social media because even though most of it's focused on this messaging thing, it meets those other criteria. You've got a profile, you can post stuff, you can network. There's an app that's using a computer, right? So Line qualifies. What about democratic values? Give me some democratic values. What do we think? A lot of freedom of speech. Alexander says freedom in general. The freedom to protest or demonstrate. Freedom of the press. Okay. Stable political system. I think stable political system is definitely part of it. But it kind of depends what kind of political system, right? So Emily's idea is good. I think having a country of the people, by the people, right? So the authority of the government comes from the voters, right? And the citizens. That's a really important part of what kind of political system it is. William gives a great specific example of freedom of speech. The right to vote, I think, falls under having a country by the people, for the people, of the people. Not being suicided or murdered, right? So the right to life, the right to not have your life be taken away illegally. Yeah, so the right not just to vote, but to vote for whoever you want. personal liberty or freedom, referendum. So referendum, that's, I think, a good example of a specific kind of voting. So these are really, really good. And you've come up with a lot of examples. And this is one where, yeah, respecting diversity, that's a good one. Yeah, I don't think anyone mentioned that, but yeah, like freedom of religion, or the ability of the fact that the government doesn't discriminate between people based on what they believe. Yeah, really good. So I, again, went through the same process, and where I actually started was I tried to figure out what the definition of a democracy is. So like, what do we need in order for it to be a democracy? And so many of you all mentioned this, and it's about how the government works. And according to this definition from Oxford Languages, which I found on Google, it says that the key point of a democracy is that it is governed by the whole population, right? So the authority of the government comes from the citizens living in it. And the actual government is usually staffed through elected representatives. So people who people vote for in elections. I have a political science degree, which is pretty useless to what I'm currently doing with my life. But in the spirit of not wasting college, I'm throwing up a political science definition as well. So Rudolf Rummel is a political scientist who made popular this idea called the democratic peace, which is the idea that democracies are much less likely to go to war in general and with each other in particular. And he defines democracy as all of this stuff, much of which you mentioned. He says everyone should be able to vote. You should be able to keep your votes secret. The elections have to be regular, so they have to happen often and consistently, and they have to be competitive, so you have to have real choices. All of these freedoms you mentioned are really important, and I don't think anyone mentioned rule of law, but that's another important idea. The idea that law is what is supreme, and no person within the country is above the law or exempt from having to follow the law. Then I looked up democratic values, and I found this list from a textbook about civics called Civitas, a Framework for Civic Education. And I chose this one to underscore specifically that this list is going to be contested. It's not an absolute list. And like social media, not everyone will agree about all of these being true democratic values. For example, you all might think of truth as a reasonable democratic value, or honesty. But some other people might say that even in a democracy, it's important for the government to have the power to lie and hide things from its people for security reasons. Is it undemocratic that the government doesn't share everything about how the military works? Is it undemocratic that in the US, only the president can decide to launch a nuclear weapon? Some people would say yes, other people would say no. It's a disputed issue. Another example is patriotism or pride in your country. In order for you to believe in democracy, do you have to be proud of your country? Some people would say yes. This textbook would say yes. Other people would say no. I think I would say no. I think you probably don't have to. You can be a believer in democracy and not be proud of your country necessarily, right? So I think some of these values are going to be debatable. And in particular, it's not just a question of whether something counts as a democratic value at all. But some of these democratic values are clearly more important than others. And that will be an important issue that is going to come up probably in all debates on this topic, where the democratic values chosen by the pro and the con are different. The teams will probably spend a lot of time comparing which one of their chosen values is more important and a better representation of democratic values as a whole. Questions about the definitions of these terms? Is it possible that as a debate, is it possible for a debater to partially agree the source of the definition you found for your speech? Yeah, for sure. So if I start my speech and I'm pro and I present, let's say, this first definition from Google as my definition, that's like a pretty mainstream definition. It's not super controversial. It sort of speaks to just the core of what we agree social media is. And the con doesn't have to challenge it. Like if the pro and the con agree from the beginning that, you know, we're really mainly talking about Facebook and Instagram or Line or whatever, then we don't even need a definition debate at all. This only really comes up when people don't agree about what the definition is. When might that happen? Well, one example is internet forums. In the US, Reddit, 4chan, 8chan, those are popular forums where lots of people make very polarizing and controversial points and arguments, and there are a lot of extremists hanging out on those forums. In Taiwan, one of the more popular forums, I believe, is called PTT. Is that right? So PTT has kind of the same perception that it's a place where a lot of extreme opinions live. So whether these forums are part of social media is something I think people could reasonably debate about. In some of these forums, it's just text. So does it count as media? We can't really create content. We can't share pictures or videos as easily unless those videos are on other platforms. So if the pro wants to include PTT and say PTT is bad for democracy, the con could present a definition and say, no, PTT is not an example of social media, so it doesn't help your argument. It doesn't prove that the resolution is true. Or I guess the con would probably want to bring up PTT. Yeah. If the pro's definition is broad, does that mean the con team can work in some specific direction? Okay. Sure. So as it kind of depends what specific arguments that each side is making. You are definitely right that if the pro uses a very broad definition, the con can criticize social media examples that they would not have been able to criticize otherwise. Like if the pro uses this definition and that all of a sudden the con has all these options. The con can be like World of Warcraft is terrible for democracy. Amazon is terrible for democracy, right? But on the flip side, the pro gets more flexibility. So the pro gets to say Wikipedia is good for democracy, which I would say that's a pretty safe argument. I'm a huge defender of Wikipedia, although I don't think you should use it in your research papers and your speeches, which we'll get into in a second. But I think Wikipedia is really, really good for society. So it kind of depends on the balance there. Shanna is right that usually it's the con team that will prefer broad definitions because it gives them more options to argue against the topic. So if I'm pro, I would probably try to figure out what the most defensible examples of social media are and make my argument as narrowly about that as possible and make my definition as narrowly about those examples as possible. Good question. Anything else? Okay. So with that, I want to get into some of the historical background for this topic and go over a super quick survey of what arguments are available on each side. So first, I'm going to start broad, which is why are we really talking about social media and democracy at all? And the reason this is a big issue focuses a lot on some of these examples that I have put on the slide here. So really, the debate about social media's effect on democracy gained a lot of popular attention and steam with the Arab Spring. For those of you who don't know, this was a series of pro-democracy revolutions that happened in the Middle East and North Africa in the spring of 2011. And it started with a religious figure setting himself on fire in Tunisia, which spurred a popular uprising there. And it spread throughout the area, and it resulted in successful revolutions in a couple of countries like Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, and less successful revolutions in other countries like Bahrain, where the revolution was defeated, and a civil war that lasted now almost a decade in Syria. So a lot of different results. But the reason this is so connected to the idea of social media is that many people think that these pro-democracy revolutions would not nearly have been as successful as they were in reality without the ability to communicate over the internet. In each country, the government often relied on denying the protesters the ability to talk to each other as a tactic to repress them. It cut phone lines. It tried to cut off access to people's internet service at home. But people were able to get around that by using their cell phone data, recording videos of what was going on, and using that to rally people onto their side and reveal the oppression that the government was perpetrating against them. Black Lives Matter protests are another great example of this in the US. Black Lives Matter activists are able to record video of police officers engaging in abuses of power and police brutality and use that to get people on their side by spreading it through social media. But at the same time, there are also downsides to social media with respect to democracy. One big concern is manipulation by international governments. And in Taiwan, I would say this is one of the biggest concerns about social media. Chinese propaganda in Taiwan social media is a big topic of debate. In the US, Chinese propaganda is also relevant, but Russia is a much bigger focus. Sure. So Shanna mentions the umbrella movement in, I believe, Hong Kong. But yeah, I should probably mention some more Taiwan-specific examples. So, I mentioned international examples because those kind of drove a lot of the international attention. But of course, the Taiwan debate about social media and democracy has some movement examples of its own, such as the Sunflower Movement, which in spring of 2014 used social media to coordinate lots of resources. Young people from many universities, including NTNU, used it as a platform to organize and to occupy the legislative yuan in order to protest the passage of a trade deal and pro-China policy. The movement for marriage equality also used social media to spread its message and get people kind of on its side. A more recent example is the Milk Tea Alliance, which I don't know if I would really call it a movement, but it's a loosely connected group of democracy activists in a variety of East Asian countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, and Taiwan. It's called the Milk Tea Alliance because milk tea is very popular in all of those places. But social media has many examples in Taiwan as well of contributing to movements. Another recent example, so propaganda and misinformation can come from international governments, like with China in Taiwan and Russia allegedly in the US. But there's also sources of misinformation at home. Many are worried about misinformation spreading from political figures. And this is definitely a big part of the debate here in Taiwan. A US example concerns Trump, Facebook, and a company called Cambridge Analytica. And the scandal there was that the Trump campaign, while Trump was running for election, partnered up with Cambridge Analytica to use Facebook data to target political advertisements with misinformation in them at specific Facebook users, which based on Facebook's private data would be very likely to believe that misinformation and become more likely to vote for his side. So we've got some benefits and some downsides. Maybe it's good for activism, but it's also good for potentially international governments looking to influence democratic societies. And it might also be good for spreading misinformation at home. So these are kind of the recent events that make this super, super relevant as a topic for us to discuss. Let's go through some specific pro and con contentions. So one pro contention concerns voter turnout. The term voter turnout refers to when people who are eligible to vote or people who are allowed to vote actually show up to vote. In Taiwan, voter turnout is consistently pretty high. It hovers around 70% in a typical election. What that means is 70% of people who can vote do vote. And what that means is that's a really good sign for the health of Taiwan's democracy. It means people believe their votes matter and they care enough to actually make their voice heard by casting a ballot. In the US, voter turnout is much lower. Depending on whether it's a local election or a presidential election, it hovers historically between 30 and 50%. So much, much lower than in Taiwan. And that's not such a good sign for the health of democracy over here. What does social media have to do with this? Well, there's a couple of examples of how social media can affect voter turnout. One is a study that is fascinating. It looks at, I think the number was 66 million Facebook users. And it compares those Facebook users who saw pro-voting advertisements to those who did not. And based on this study, it estimates that the presence of pro-voting advertisements on social media increased the number of votes in the US election by 340,000, which is quite a lot if you consider how many votes are actually deciding who wins presidential elections in the US. Another reason is called the social contagion effect. Contagion's a big looking fancy word, but what it really means is it's a word borrowed from disease. So you can be contagious or you can spread a disease to someone else. And so this term uses that analogy and applies it to voting on social media. And the argument is if you see a lot of your friends posting pictures or statuses or videos of themselves voting, or in the US, they usually give out these little stickers that say, I voted, and a lot of people stick them on their chest and take a picture for social media. And the theory is that seeing all of your friends voting will make you more likely to vote too. So that's the social contagion effect. I said turnout was not a big concern in Taiwan, and that's generally true, but that doesn't mean it never matters. And a big example of when it mattered recently was in the rise and fall of Han Kuo-yu. Han Kuo-yu, regardless of what you think of him, ran a very, very bold election campaign. And he and his political campaign used social media extensively as part of their effort to reach out to people who are not normally targeted by politicians, to make sure that everybody in the electorate heard his promises and his theories about politics and what he wanted to accomplish with his campaign. In the more recent recall vote, turnout played an even bigger role. In order for a recall vote to be successful, which this one was, and it was the first successful recall vote for a major elected position in Taiwan's democratic history, there's actually a requirement that at least 25% of the population has to come and vote. Otherwise, the recall vote doesn't count, no matter what the results are. And Han Kuo-yu's main strategy for defeating the effort to recall him was trying to convince people not to vote. And the recall campaign used social media to counter that messaging and encourage people to show up and cast their ballots regardless. So some theoretical arguments and a recent Taiwan example as well. Any questions about that? Okay. Another pro argument concerns informed voters. Social media can improve the quality of the information that voters get for 3 reasons. One is that, for better or for worse, many young people do not read the news. They do not watch the news. Social media is many young people's only source of information about the world and about politics in their country. And this is true both in the US and in Taiwan. So social media plays a powerful role in telling young people what is happening so that they know who to vote for and they know the importance of participating in elections. Another benefit is centralized fact checking. So companies like Facebook, in the wake of recent scandals about their role in spreading fake news in elections, have really stepped up their game in trying to make sure that they do not become platforms for lies and divisive misinformation. So many of these companies have central offices dedicated to preventing the spread of misinformation. And if you've been on Facebook recently, you've probably seen these little banners under some posts that say, oh, this post maybe contains some information that you should fact check, or this post contains some inaccurate information about the COVID vaccine, something like that. Facebook is really stepping this up to avoid having this problem of lies spreading on their platform. So because everyone is talking in the same place, it gives this unique opportunity for not just lies to spread, but also the truth when people fact check those lies and put the power of Facebook's programs to work in service of making sure everyone knows true information. Another benefit is having diverse viewpoints. So without social media and before social media, there actually were not that many ways that you could get access to information. Or, there were many ways, but you had to go out and look for them. And they were much more limited than with social media. There would be your TV stations and your newspapers. And those provided some options, but that was really it. And becoming a TV station or a newspaper is hard. It requires a lot of work. And so not that many people did it. And the result is that the spread of viewpoints was quite limited. There are some viewpoints that just didn't get that much airtime or that much attention because TV and newspapers chose not to carry them. Now, you might think that's a good thing, but there's also an argument that that's information that could be true that people just aren't seeing because there's no chance for it to spread. And that's something social media can potentially address. I'm sure for many of you, many examples are coming to mind of how this could be bad, but it can also be good. If you think of any example when social media was used to expose corruption in a government or spread information about some kind of scandal that's relevant to lots of people, right? So social media can serve a powerful role in, or can play a powerful role in that capacity. Another pro argument is civil rights. I'm not going to rehash this because I talked a lot about this earlier, but social media can be helpful for movements for lots of reasons. It can help gather resources. It can help attract attention. It can help coordinate people who have a tough time talking to one another otherwise and planning their activities. And there are many examples both around the world and in Taiwan of how this can occur. Another pro argument is governance. So this one is pretty Taiwan specific, and I included this because, again, of my experience when I showed up in Taiwan to quarantine. And I don't know how many of you all have gone through this process, but when I was coming here for the first time, this process was completely amazing to me, mostly because coming from the US, it's something that worked so well that I could never even imagine the US doing anything similar. Like there's just no shot that the US would ever attempt something of this complexity and pull it off so successfully. But the quarantine system was actually based on a partnership with Line. And so I showed up, I through Line made contact with a quarantine officer. You know, we were in constant communication. They would check in with me to see how I was doing. I filled in these little surveys that were distributed through Line by some bot where I told it how I was feeling regularly. So that was awesome. And that's an example of how democratic governments can partner with social media to make their policies more effective. Other COVID response policies were also enhanced by social media. For example, in the early days of the pandemic, when masks were really scarce, people used social media to coordinate the development of these apps that told you where you could go buy masks. I'm sure many of you remember this. Government communication is also an important tool of governance that democratic countries can use. In this latest outbreak that we're in the middle of, this has been a really, really important tool that the government uses. So sure, the government gives press conferences, but the government also tweets, makes Facebook posts, and that really allows the government to get its message out, tell people what they need to do, what the current restrictions are, and how they can stay safe at this dangerous and concerning moment. So social media partnerships really enhance governance capabilities because they help kind of reach out and make policies more effective. Another argument for the pro concerns women's rights. This is similar to the diversity of viewpoints point I was going over earlier, but it's slightly different because it focuses on women's representation. So I don't know what the statistic is in Taiwan, but in the US, one study said that women are extremely underrepresented in media. In fact, only 38% of bylines. So the byline is like in an article where it says by whoever, only 38% of those were women. So much less than half. So in social media, it's actually the opposite. I think the statistic for Instagram is that the average female Instagrammer has something like 5 times more followers than the average male Instagrammer. On Twitter, it's much less of a disproportionate following, but it's still, there's a tendency for women to be much more equally represented on social media than in traditional media like newspapers. And social media also creates these powerful movements for women's rights, such as the hashtag #MeToo movement, which, as you can tell from the hashtag, is very, very deeply connected to its social media roots, even if it has since spread to other places. The last pro argument, the last pro argument I want to talk about is fundraising. So fundraising, one of those things that I would say is a debatable democratic value. I'm not sure how directly connected to democracy this is, but I thought this is cool, so I thought I'd mention it because it's a very big thing that social media does that some people will argue helps democracies. it raises the visibility of causes and gets people to give money to those causes really effectively. The Ice Bucket Challenge, which was raising money for a cure for ALS, raised 220 million US dollars, which is crazy. Hashtag Giving Tuesday, which is a hashtag that basically says, you should use this hashtag and then give money to your favorite charity. I don't have a recent statistic about it, but it gathers tons of money every year, and it's increasing year over year. So before I go into the con, any questions about those pro contentions? No questions. Wow, my explanations must be amazing because all of you got them on the first try. I'm just kidding. I'm sure my explanations were far from perfect. And if some of you are confused about some things I said, it's totally okay. Feel more than free to ask. Okay. Yes. So we just went over the pro. Now we'll go over some of the con contentions next. Okay. Let's go over the con contentions. So the big con contention, unsurprisingly, is fake news. So lots of examples of this. Russia infiltrating US elections is something that a lot of people think of when you say fake news and social media. One study that I read said that in a survey of factual and fake news stories, the top 20 fake news stories on Facebook all got more engagement than any factual story. Engagement meaning a like, a share, or a comment. So more people clicked on and engaged with fake stories than factual stories, which suggests that social media spreads lies more than it spreads the truth. This is a particular worry in Taiwan, where, like I said earlier, Chinese propaganda is a really, really big concern. A study out of Sweden said that Taiwan, of all the countries in the world, is one of the top global targets for cyber misinformation. And China accounts for a big reason for that. The study looked at trends in internet traffic, so like where countries are communicating and what country communications go to what other countries. And the volume of Chinese misinformation going to Taiwan was crazy and one of the highest in the world. One example of this is the 50 Cent Army. So the reason they're called the 50 Cent Army is this is a group of people that supposedly work for the PLA, the Chinese army, and supposedly, although of course this is not public, so we have no proof of this, but allegedly this is a group of people that gets paid 50 cents every time they make a fake news post in another country or in China itself. So China actually has this group of people that gets paid by the post to spread lies and propaganda. A more public example concerns CTI News, which recently lost its broadcasting license in Taiwan because it was accused of being Chinese propaganda. This was super controversial because people accused that decision of stripping CTI's broadcast license of being politically biased against the KMT. Relatedly, domestic misinformation is also a big concern. Common term for this is internet warriors, which are supposedly these propaganda artists, these misinformation artists that do similar things to China's 50 Cent Army and spread political misinformation favoring one party or another. Some of them allegedly attached to the party itself and others operating on their own. Another side of this, which I haven't talked about yet, but is also arguably very important, is what what responses are available to the government. So if you are in charge of the government and you have to pass a law that regulates fake news, you can do some real damage to democracy if you're not careful. The reason is that laws restricting what people can say on the internet, no matter how well written, inherently are a risk to free speech because they restrict what people are allowed to say, that they otherwise would have been allowed to say. So it's inherently anti-democratic in some ways. So if this legislation is poorly designed, that's a huge risk. Emily mentions that women's followers on social media, or women having more followers on social media, comes from women's popularity more than women's rights. And that's probably true. I think the connection between having followers and being able to push for your rights is potentially not as good as a pro team might want you to believe. And as a con team, you will certainly want to say that if the pro team makes this argument. I did put this towards the end on purpose because I don't think that contention is great. But again, my goal is not to say what is true. My goal is just to give you a list of things you might encounter out there in the debate wilds. Questions about fake news. Great question. If the pro makes a fundraising argument, doesn't that mean the pro has a broad definition of democratic values? It sure does. I would say under narrow definitions of democratic values, fundraising for charity is probably not included. So if the pro wants to make this argument, they'd better have a pretty broad and strong definition. Otherwise, the con can defeat all of this by just saying fundraising doesn't count as a democratic value. Related to fake news is this idea of conspiracy theories and extremism. So social media has been accused of making massive contributions to the spread of extremism and conspiracy theories about lots of different topics in both the US and in Taiwan. Something called QAnon in the US is this surprisingly large movement which says that the US government and the world government are run by pedophiles and child sex traffickers, and Donald Trump is a secret agent who is going to take this ring of sex traffickers down, and people in the US need to be ready with their guns to help Trump take down the government so he can beat these child sex traffickers and these demon worshippers. QAnon probably would not have been so successful if social media and these forums where people can just go on there and say whatever they want did not exist. One of the original places it spread was, I think, either 4chan or 8chan. I don't know which one. They're basically the same. People just go on there to be racist and to say things that suck. It is really unfortunate that these websites exist, but one could argue that if you take social media, you gotta take the good with the bad, and these are kind of the cost of having the ability to speak freely on the internet. And as I'm sure you're all aware, this has actually led to large examples of violence in the US, such as the attempt to stop the certification of the US election by storming the US Capitol building on January 6th. There are examples of this in Taiwan too. In recent months, especially, there has been a huge spread of conspiracy theories on social media in Taiwan trying to convince Taiwanese people not to get the vaccine. These range from myths about how the side effects of the vaccine that no one has proven. Like one popular one was that if you take the vaccine, you will never have kids, which is obviously nonsense, but it's something that is spreading on social media. COVID related, oh yeah, Shanna's favorite one is that the vaccine makes you magnetic. So like you can, do you all know about Magneto, the superhero? Magneto can like be a magnet and like move metal things around, kind of like, using remote control. So yeah, the claim is the vaccine makes you like that. Honestly, I kind of wish it did. That sounds pretty cool. But sadly, I guess the vaccine does not make you magnetic. So complete nonsense, but it spreads on social media because nobody can really stop it. There are also more violent and more messed up examples, such as the spread of fake stories about how immigrants brought COVID and spread COVID in parts of Taipei where many immigrants live. Stories about how immigrants are hoarding the vaccine, stopping people from getting vaccinated. Stories about how immigrants are skirting that COVID restrictions, not wearing masks, going outside, gathering, right? All these fake stories that are designed to get you to react emotionally and be angry at immigrants, which stokes division and is bad for those democratic values of fairness and equal treatment of people that many of you were talking about earlier. Another con is data protection. I won't talk about this one too long because it's super simple, I think. But the general risk here is social media knows a lot about you. And that can be dangerous. It can be dangerous if the social media company gives all that information to the government, as it did in the US, until a big scandal in 2013 caused legal reforms that tried to put a stop to that. Until then, all these social media companies basically had a partnership with the government where the government could find out anything these companies know about you with a tool that basically works like Google. Pretty creepy. In Taiwan, the big concern is not really domestic, but foreign. And the risk there is China once again. TikTok, as you know, I'm sure, is a China-based company. The US has actually restricted TikTok, although that restriction got lifted recently. But the fear was that information given to TikTok goes straight to the Chinese military. There's also a hacking risk. So if your account gets hacked, that can be used for propaganda and identity theft, which feeds back into some of these other notions that I was going over a second ago. Another idea is recency bias. Recency bias is a fancy term for something that most people would call like a tendency towards outrage, or people call social media an outrage machine. And this idea refers to the fact that on social media, the attention span of people on social media tends to be pretty short. Like social media as a whole doesn't do a great job of focusing and getting super deep on an issue over a long period of time. Instead, it's very biased to recent information and recent ideas, rather than kind of these long-term structural trends. And this can be bad for public discourse because it makes people worse at discussing the problems of the day. And it can even affect conversations outside of social media when traditional media cites social media discussions as analysis that it uses to generate news. Last, privacy. This is another one of those edge cases. So there's part of this is pretty core to democracy, I think, and part of it is a little less core. The part that's core to democracy is the part I mentioned earlier, which is that if the government gets information from social media, then that is obviously bad for democracy because the government is spying on people, and if we believe there's a right to privacy, that's obviously a problem. A part that's less fringe and maybe more Taiwan relevant is the fact that these companies, even if they don't share that information, know a lot about you and can manipulate you. And that can be both anti-democratic if they're making you do something you wouldn't do otherwise, and it can also just be plain creepy because your social media companies know a lot of things about you if you really think about it. So there are privacy concerns that really can't be separated from social media as a whole. All right. This concludes my topic survey. Do we have questions about anything that I have talked about? Could I explain recency bias again? Yes. I think a better term to think of this as is outrage culture. So it's the cycle of you see a story on Twitter, you're mad about it, you make a post, you're like, oh, I can't believe this. Then another story comes up, and then you're mad about that, and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe this. And then another story, and then another story, and 5 stories later, you've forgotten about the first story, which is natural, right? People can't focus on all of this information at once, but social media just gives you so much, and it's all unfiltered, and it's all relevant because you care about all of it, and you can get mad at any of it, that it makes you much more likely to care about recent problems than to take this big picture long-term perspective. And Shane is absolutely right. This plays into biases that happen in your brain as well. So social media works together with your psychological biases to try to get you to constantly stay online, right? If you didn't need social media for the latest updates, you wouldn't click very often because you wouldn't care about getting the latest. You would just care about getting an occasional update. But social media wants you to click as much as possible. So they focus on these updates and this recent information the most to get you to click on it more. And that can be very bad for how you think about the news. No, I didn't. I forgot to talk about that on that slide. Yes, echo chamber. So this is, I would say, a fake news concern mostly, or like a misinformation concern. So the idea of an echo chamber is, think about who you are friends with on social media. Most of you are probably mostly friends with people you agree with. So you are friends with your friends. You're friends with maybe your family. You're friends with coworkers you like, right? So the majority of the people you're friends with are the people who think like you. And this, again, is natural. You know, you don't want to see people saying things that make you mad or things that make you upset because you disagree with them. You want people to make you feel good by saying that you're right. You don't want your worldview challenged. And that's okay. I mean, I'm not saying you specifically, like, I don't want my worldview challenged either. My social media is also mostly people I agree with. But the damage of that is, in the same way that social media can expose you to more diverse viewpoints, it can also make it so you only see this one kind of perspective. It's one set of information that's given to you, and you don't get the opposite side of the story because there's no reason for you to look for it. You're only shown what you already believe. And it's called an echo chamber because in an echo chamber, you say something and then your own words come back to you as an echo. And social media often works the same way. If you ask the people in your circle about an opinion, many people in your circle will echo your opinion back to you because you chose them based on how likely they are to agree with you. And that can cause misinformation because if your circle has a wrong belief, it's very unlikely to get challenged. Nice. Thank you, Shannon, for reminding me about that. What else? Okay. It does not look like there are any more questions, I don't think. So if more questions come up in a second, that is totally fine. But for now, why don't we take a 10-minute break? Because I've just been talking at you for the last little while. So why don't we come back at 3:30? And after that, we will do our research session. How's that sound? All right. Back at 3:30. Thank you all for being such a good audience.